Ari, and as usual, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm a big fan of Ari Katz and of your program, and it's always an honor to join it in whatever capacity. And today is fun, all the more fun for me, in that I get to talk about my book, which came out now exactly 10 years ago. This is the book we'll be talking about. I'm not really selling books, so it's not about that at this point, but it is still a subject near and dear to my heart, and as I hope you'll all discover, there's a lot to it. In fact, I would say that this book is really several books in one. I'm going to start talking about the overarching issues it covers, but it also is it contains 4 separate profiles of 4 American Jewish celebrity figures. And what I won't be doing today is going into any great depth on any of them, but I will talk about them briefly, and when we open it up to questions, I hope I'm more than willing to talk about any of these figures in greater depth. You'll hear who they are shortly. But first, let me talk about the title. It's a funny title. I've gotten a little flack about that from time to time. People have said to me, "Oh, if only you'd given it a normal title, you would have done so much better with it." Not sure that's true, but the word Jewhooing in the title, Jewhooing the 60s, is a word that not everyone is familiar with. I didn't invent it. It was, in fact, coined by a colleague of mine who was writing about Jewish identity and noticed that on social media at the time, this is 10, 15 years ago already, there was a website called Jewhoo, which was a takeoff on Yahoo, right? What was Jewhoo? I don't know if anyone remembers it. It's no longer online, but it was there for several years. Jewhoo was a website that you could go to and type in any name of a famous person to find out if they were Jewish or not, right? So you would type in Natalie Portman, and it would come back, yes, she's not only Jewish, she's the daughter of Israeli parents and speaks a fluent Hebrew, and right? So that was the whole point of that website, was to give us a mechanism for determining who's Jewish and who isn't in the public sphere. And that is what Jewhooing means. Jewhooing means pointing out the famous Jews in the culture. Now, it's true that every culture, every ethnic group, every religious group, racial group, what have you, does a similar thing. If you're Italian, you're very proud of Frank Sinatra and whoever else may be Italian. If you're Black or Asian or what have you, you are that much more aware of the celebrity members of your group as representatives of your group. Now, my argument is that Jews, as is often the case, do this a little bit more often than other groups. Now, for one reason, we have an awful lot of celebrities, right? There are an awful lot of people to point to, but it also is a reflection of that funny aspect of Jewish life and Jewish identity, where many Jews, especially those Jews in the public eye, don't advertise the fact that they're Jewish, right? They so-called pass for being not Jews, which throws it back to the rest of us to point out the fact that they are. Now, before you dismiss this as this ethnocentric, funny quirk that some Jews practice, let me throw it to you and ask this group: how many of you, when the titles come scrolling down at the end of a TV show or a film, and a number of them are Jewish names, is that something that you'll notice or even perhaps look for? Right? Okay, well, that's Jewhooing, right? How many of you know, for example, how many Jews currently serve on the United States Supreme Court? We lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that leaves how many? Does anyone know? There are 2. Or excuse me, we lost Stephen Breyer, so now we're down to 1. Elena Kagan is the one remaining Jewish justice on the Supreme Court. So if you keep track of those kinds of things, if you know, for example, and here, this is a little generational, of those of you who are a little bit more senior will recall that certain Hollywood celebrities, we knew not only that they were Jewish, we knew their real name. How many people know the real name of Tony Curtis? I want to hear it. What's Tony Curtis's real name? That's right. If you said Bernie Schwartz, you were right. It's that knowledge that, again, it's a kind of a quirky habit that we have of paying attention to who's Jewish and who's not, and making it our business to know a little bit about them. You may recall Adam Sandler in the 1990s, comedian, now very well known for the movies he's made. Then he was a member of Saturday Night Live. He wrote a song for Hanukkah. He called the Hanukkah song. And what is that song about? It's entirely about naming all of the celebrities in Hollywood who are Jewish, right? And he makes the point that the two leads of Star Trek, both Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, both Jews, right? Again, we pay attention. We are aware. Now, why is this worth writing a book about? Well, it's my contention that that's really just the tip of an iceberg. It's really just it's a quirky habit on the one hand, which reflects something much deeper. And that deeper phenomenon is the relationship that we Jews have to the phenomenon of celebrity in America. As you know, we have a history with show business. Jews and show business have an intimate and long-standing relationship. And the product of show business and of Hollywood and of the movies and of comedy and music and all of those various forms of popular culture, the outcome is the creation, the production of celebrities. Now, as Jews, as a minority in America, this Jew-hooing habit of ours is my contention, my argument in the book, is that it reflects to some degree a lingering insecurity that we have as a minority. We want to know how our representatives are reflecting us, are representing us. So my celebrities, for example, one of them is Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand is someone who, as I'm sure everyone here knows, and again, this is an example of Jewhooing that we know this. Barbra Streisand made the conscious decision early in her career not to fix her nose. Again, how many people knew that? Okay. We know that, and we cherish that little item, that little fact, because it makes us feel good knowing that she held the line. She refused to assimilate. She held on to her Jewishness. She made it a point to be proud of it, even though she was in the process of becoming a major celebrity. Another example, another one of my my figures is Sandy Koufax. I won't even tell you what he's known for. What is the Jewish connection or association we have with Sandy Koufax? Right? It happened during the World Series of 1965. The first game of the World Series happened to fall on Yom Kippur. And what did Sandy Koufax do? The great pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers at the time. He chose not to pitch because it was a Jewish holiday. He was a good Jewish boy, a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn, in fact. Right? I already said before that I'm from New York. I actually like to think of myself as from Brooklyn, but you know, lahavdil, it's not that big a difference. These are some of the reasons that we have that habit, that Jewhooing is a feature of Jewish culture. But in the process of writing a lengthier book about it, I broke it down into a number of different areas and different, and as I said earlier, the book is really many books in one. So one of the aspects of this, or the connections I made, was that Jewhooing took on a certain greater resonance, or it accelerated at a certain point in time. And that's to say that we certainly did it back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. We, living in our Jewish neighborhoods in places like Brooklyn and the Bronx and you know, in LA, Fairfax, and other Jewish neighborhoods around the country, right? Second generation Jews certainly knew that the Marx Brothers were Jewish, and Milton Berle on television was Jewish, and right, and Tony Curtis was. We certainly knew it, but it's only in around the turn of the 1960s, I argue, that it becomes something that we find. There are going to be columns in Jewish newspapers. There are going to be Jewish jokes about it. The song that Adam Sandler writes in the 90s is a later expression of that increased interest in our Jewish celebrities. So what is it about the early 60s? And so the book, again, entitled Jewhooing the Sixties, became a meditation on a particular period in American Jewish life. As a historian, right, I think historically, I think in terms of periods and change over time. And I realized very quickly that when we talk about the 60s, we generally think about the later part of the 60s. The word 60s and the image that conveys is the 1968 Summer of Love and 69 Woodstock, and that period of time, that countercultural efflorescence of hippiedom and feminism and other and anti-war efforts, and that's what we usually think about with the 60s. And a lot of change comes out of that, and in fact, change emerges from that revolutionary period for Jewish life and for the history of Judaism even, right? But prior to that, several years earlier, in the early 1960s, the Kennedy years, and of course the assassination in 1963, and then the early years of the civil rights movement and the early years of the anti-war movement in the first half of the decade, it turned out, the more I looked at it, turned out to be highly significant for Jewish life in general, and specifically for this issue of Jewish celebrity. Now, what's happening in the early 60s to make that, to cause those kinds of changes? Well, for one thing, there's a generational shift. I mentioned the second generation earlier. Since the majority of American Jews derived from the great immigration at the turn of the 20th century, when 2 million Jews, mostly from Eastern Europe, arrive in this country. Most of them come through New York City and then spread throughout the country later on. That's the majority of American Jews to this day. And so we talk about the movement from that first generation, the immigrants, to their children, the second generation period, which has its heyday in the years between the world wars. And then in the post-World War II period, the 50s and 60s, we have the emergence of the third generation. Now, as a student of American Jewish sociology, in addition to history, one of the ways we chart changes and development in American Jewish life is generation by generation. Each generation has its own characteristics, has its own forms of Judaism and Jewish practice, has its own form of Jewish identity, as well as its own socioeconomic level and educational level, etc. It's right around 1960, the turn of the 60s, that third generation becomes dominant. And it's the moment when the majority of young American Jews are going to college. Jews to this day have one of the highest rates of university attendance. And that really begins with the third generation in the 1960s. So we have an entirely new generation, fully Americanized, moving up the economic ladder as well as the cultural and social ladders of American life. And one of the things that will result from that is going off to college and becoming more fully American in our cultural makeup. It means that we will go out and meet non-Jews much more often and much more easily than our parents did back in the old Jewish neighborhoods where they grew up, right? We, the third generation, go out into America. And it means that we often meet and fall in love with non-Jewish people. And therefore, it's at that moment in the early 1960s that the rate of marriage between Jews and non-Jews, sometimes we call it intermarriage, sometimes we call it interfaith marriage. Today, it's become completely normal and completely, the norm in every sense. But it's right around the early 60s that the rate begins to rise dramatically. And it's a moment, therefore, for those who are observing this happening of some degree of anxiety. What does this mean for the future? What does it mean for the nature of Jewish community and Jewish life and Jewish identity? So those kinds of questions begin to emerge. Now, it's not just about interfaith issues. There are other issues going on at the time. Early 60s, it also so happens that is the moment in American Jewish memory when our consciousness of the Holocaust kicks into high gear. Right? For most of the 50s, it was there was Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust literature to some degree. But first of all, the word itself hadn't come into common usage. the word Holocaust only becomes commonly used and our consciousness of it is raised once the Israelis capture Adolf Eichmann in Argentina and not only bring him back to Jerusalem to put him on trial, but they televise that trial. It is an internationally televised moment, putting that Nazi war criminal on trial and introducing not only Jews, but the entire world to the subject of the Holocaust in a way that had not occurred previously. Even with the Nuremberg trials, even with everything that happened post-World War II, once it's on television, it reaches an entirely new level. So happens the Eichmann trial coincided with a Hollywood treatment. There was a major Hollywood blockbuster about the Nuremberg trials that only comes out in the fall of 1961, or sorry, the fall of 1960, comes out just after JFK is elected president. So it's that moment. It also happens to be the moment where Elie Wiesel's Night is published in English. It's the moment when the very first textbook on the history of the Holocaust by Raoul Hilberg is published right around 1960-61. So things are happening, things are in the air. And then one more I'll add, which relates to the Holocaust. And as you all know, when we think of the terrible catastrophe of the Holocaust, we often then switch to the compensation, or the answer to that, of course, was the establishment of the state of Israel. Right? They almost destroyed us entirely, but we were able to reconstitute ourselves and build a state, a Jewish state in that moment. Israel, interestingly enough, also is kind of on a back burner for most American Jews through the 1940s and 50s. It's not that we weren't Zionist and supportive of Israel and cheered when it was established. Of course we did. But it's only around 1960 when it enters collective consciousness, once again, through the medium of popular culture. Another blockbuster film comes out in 1960 called Exodus. And it's the first moment that, it was in 59 that it was a best-selling novel by Leon Uris, and that was a phenomenon in its own right. The first time that Jews were seen, again, in popular culture as heroic, as, tough fighting men, right? Who like the Paul Newman playing the role in the movie epitomized that the year later. And of course, the film, as popular as the novel had been, it was on the best-selling list for 30 weeks in a row. As popular and as impactful as the novel was, the film that comes out puts Israel on the map, elevates it in our consciousness, turns it into a key component of American Jewish pride and identity. And that's been the case ever since. So again, it's the early 60s, something's going on with Jewishness and Jewish identity. Number of things are happening in the culture. And the last thing I'll mention that happens in the culture, and this also goes to the third generation, Jews in show business had always been very active from the very beginning. In the immigrant period, you had Al Jolson and Fanny Brice. In the second generation era, I mentioned people like Milton Berle and the Marx Brothers. You also had certainly lots of Jews. You had the Jews who were running the Hollywood studios. But it's not until the early 60s that you have Jews throughout the popular culture ecosystem, in the news and on television and behind the scenes as producers and writers. And we kind of, we don't quite take over. It's never a monopoly held by Jews, but the dominance of Jews in the media reaches a new level in the 1960s. So right at the beginning of the 60s, it's the beginning of Barbara Walters' career, and Mike Wallace's career takes off at that moment. And you have Sing Along with Mitch. What was his name? Mitch Miller. You have Mitch Miller comes along at that moment, and Herb Alpert of the Tijuana Brass. These are all Jews, right? They all emerge in that early 1960s moment. Most of them not necessarily explicitly identified as Jews, but once again, we're going to make it our business to point it out. And little by little, some of those figures will in fact take on a greater sense of public Jewish identification. So a good example is Eddie Fisher. Eddie Fisher, as you'll recall, will marry Elizabeth Taylor. She will convert to Judaism. This is in the late 50s. Eddie Fisher was a very popular singer, not quite at the level of Frank Sinatra, but second tier. He will go on record as having embraced Judaism, and he talks about visiting Israel, and he talks about the Jewish jewelry he wears, and he will incorporate Hava Nagila into his concert set in Las Vegas. And again, this is right around the turn of the 60s. Something is happening. Jewishness is beginning to be injected into the culture in a way that it had never quite felt comfortable doing before. You may know the phrase "too Jewish." Through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, if a performer wanted to be explicitly Jewish, they were kept away. They were suppressed, right? Producers, most of whom were Jewish themselves, would say to a Jewish performer, no, that name or that hair color or that whatever is too Jewish. You want to pass. To be Jewish publicly was still taboo for the most part. That begins to change in the early 1960s. And one of the media of this, one of the mechanisms of this change will be celebrity identification, both they themselves being willing to announce their Jewishness, and we in the audience pointing to them and Jewhooing. Those are two processes that begin together. I write in the book at length about the importance of celebrity in our culture. It's one of those things that we tend to dismiss and deride. It's a trivial thing. Someone like the Kardashian family, why are they famous to begin with? Celebrity almost has a kind of a negative quality. It's diminishing in and of itself. It's something we do not tend to value, and yet we're mesmerized by it. The more famous they are, the more they are part of our psyche, the more they are part of our cultural outlook and consciousness. And celebrities, therefore, do, for better or for worse, have influence over us. They do affect us. And there have been any number, there's an entire field now called celebrity studies, which looks at the various ways in which stardom and celebrity affect us and impact our lives. One last area I'll talk about is I also took the opportunity. Again, I like showing the book. The subtitle is American Celebrity and Jewish Identity, and so I took the opportunity to talk a little bit about Jewish identity. And before I get to my figures, let me talk for a bit about that. This is actually one area where it's, and again, I have to thank Ari for asking me to do this book talk. I haven't done this in a little while, so it's a pleasure to revisit something that I'm so fond of, but it also forced me to take a look at how things have changed in 10 years. And it's been a very eventful 10 years, my friends, right? The nature of Jewish identity is something that is in constant flux. And in writing the book, I was interested in that 1960s moment when it was changing. But the fact is that it is going through changes as we speak. And I want to kind of acknowledge that as a Jewish historian, my interest, my study is of Jews and their engagement in the world as Jews, and what makes Jews distinctive as a group, and what their attitudes and behaviors and events that occur to them all have meaning for Jews and thus for Jewish history. That is an approach to understanding Jews that is sometimes called a form of ethnic study. In other words, my interest in Jews is as a group, as an ethnic group. Various times in the past, they've been called, a century or more ago, they were called a race, a racial group. Many Jews, most notably Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, introduced a term that he learned from the Zionist movement, and he retitled the group a people. And this is something that we all now use quite often. We call ourselves the Jewish people has become very, very common and very widely accepted. There are any number of ways to think of Jews as a group, but in some, it's an ethnos. It's a group that we are Jews by virtue of our relationship to one another. We are members of a group. We are an affinity group. We are associated with one another. And our history influences who we are and how we think of ourselves. Now, all of that may sound self-evident to you, but it's come under some degree of attack in recent years. One thing that we used to say quite often, and by we, it's not only Jewish scholars, but Jews in general, back in the old days, in the 20th century, something that we said quite often was that one of the things that sets Jews apart, that makes Jews different, is that Jews are not merely an ethnic group like Italians, Chinese, Hungarians, right? Nor are Jews just another religious group like Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalians, right? Jews are both at once. And the late Leonard Fine, a longtime editor of Moment magazine, once described to make this point. He wrote about a childhood memory where he heard the great Paul Robeson sing "Ballad for Americans." It was a very popular song back in the 1940s, a very patriotic song. And in that song, Robeson lists all the great ethnic groups that make up America. And in another part of the song, he lists all the great religious groups that make up America. And little Leonard Fine, at the age of 8 years old, heard something funny in that song. The only group to be on both lists were the Jews. All right, so what I've just shared with you used to be fairly de rigueur, fairly accepted and commonplace. Lately, in this last decade or two, it's begun to be questioned, let's say, in that we have begun to swing the pendulum back toward the religious end of this divide, ethnic, religious, right? We're some combination, but more and more of late, and especially as we move further away from the immigrant experience, and more of us have mixed families where part of our family doesn't have Jewish parentage or Jewish ancestors, right? So more and more, we as a Jewish community are beginning to speak of ourselves and think of ourselves as members of a religious community, as opposed to a people, an ethnos, a nation, etc. Right? All of that was part of the Zionist history, and thus becomes part of the American Jewish experience. But lately, it's under some questioning, and I was kind of thinking about that in relation to my book, which is very much a study of ethnic behavior. I was thinking how I might approach it differently at this moment, and I realized that I probably might have chosen to address what's become a fascinating issue over the last few years, 2, 3, 4 years, I'd say, and that is the rising number of fellow Jews of color. It's primarily Black Jews, but it's also Asian Jews and Sephardic Jews, Native American Jews, Jews not from the Ashkenazic, European, and therefore white lineage, right? More and more, a larger percentage of our community, one study has it at 12 to 15%. I think that's probably a little bit of an inflated number, but the point is, it is a larger percentage than we had believed. And on the one hand, this is wonderful. We, as a mixed multitude, that was the biblical phrase, we came out of Egypt as a mixed multitude. We've been mixed group from the beginning, at least according to the Torah, right? So diversity in Jewish life is a good thing. If you've spent any time in Israel, it's something that will come as second nature to you. We American Jews are just beginning to grapple with what it means to be diverse, as opposed to almost everyone's Ashkenazic. There's a term for that. It's called Ashkenormativity. The idea that Ashkenazic Jewishness is the rule, is the norm, and everything else is a deviation. And we're just meeting this issue nowadays. I think it's a good thing. But what it's done is to call this ethnic issue into question. So, for example, when it comes to joohooing, one of the elements of that practice or that habit of pointing to Jews is we are looking to see if they look Jewish, right? Barbra Streisand not fixing her nose meant that she kept her Ashkenazic Jewish looks. She was that much more identifiable and recognizable as being a Jewish woman. Well, that's being questioned nowadays because that's buying in to Ashkenormativity, right? We now want to acknowledge that one can be Jewish and look like the rainbow. And again, in Israel, that's fairly, normative, but we American Jews are just beginning to grapple. So in rewriting the book, I might, if I wrote a sequel, I might consider including Sammy Davis Jr., right, as one of the early 60s figures who was a very famous Jew at that time. Of course, he was a convert to Judaism, but as a Black Jewish man who made no bones about it, he factors into once again, this relationship that we, the public, have with our celebrity representatives. Now, I should point out, there's an American Masters PBS documentary on Sammy Davis Jr. that I want to highly recommend. I did get to participate in that as one of the talking heads talking about Sammy Davis Jr., and I was the Jewish expert. So, there was, at least in my earlier thinking, there was a little bit of acknowledgement of Jews of color. But it's become a much bigger issue nowadays, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if anyone has any questions, we can talk about that further. But let me now, this has all been by way of introduction. Now let me switch to the 4 key figures. They're not only in the cover of my book, you can also see them on the wall of my living room, right? They are 4 figures who become extraordinarily famous in the early 1960s. They all appear on the scene at almost the same time. In fact, the first one was a baseball player, I mentioned him earlier, who in the spring before the season begins in 1961, he's been struggling. He's not yet the great pitcher that he's soon to become. For several years as a Dodger, he's had, for those of you who are baseball fans, he's had great stuff, as they say. He could throw a fastball, but he had very bad control. He couldn't place the pitches, and that means that he wasn't having much success. And his catcher in spring training of 1961, the catcher's name was Norm Sherry, he also happened to be a Jewish fellow, said to him, "Sandy, why don't you try taking something off the ball? Don't throw as hard. Let's see what happens." And he tried that. And from that moment on, he very quickly becomes, over the next 6 years, one of the greatest, if not the greatest pitcher in baseball history. His name is Sandy Koufax. He will, in September of 1961, set his first major league strikeout record, which will be the first of many records that he will set. That occurred on September 21st of that year, late in the season. The reason that date is important is that it's just a day later that there'll be another item in the newspaper about a fellow young Jew. And this was a comedian who was already making a name for himself down in Greenwich Village and also in clubs around the country. In the late 50s, he'd already gained some notoriety as being one of the new breed of sick comics, of people that would shock your sensibilities. You never quite knew what they were about to say. On September 20, Sandy Koufax was 27th. This is September 29th, 2 days later. He will be arrested for the first time. He will have said some things on stage that offended certain members of the local police, and they will bust down his hotel door later that evening, find some prescription pills on his dresser, and haul him off to jail to show him that he can't get away with that. That, of course, will be the first of many such arrests of Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce was, again, an up-and-coming comic who, in September of 1961, acquires a new level of notoriety. Sadly, 6 years later, the same period that Sandy Koufax will be a great pitcher, will be a period of decline of Lenny Bruce, and he will die of an overdose in 1966, but not before having changed the face of American comedy, also very much as a Jew. Thirdly, also on that same day, September 29th, in the same newspaper, if you go and read the New York Times of that date, in the music section, there will be a review written by the music critic of the Times named Robert Shelton. Robert Shelton's original name was Shapiro. Right? And what did I just do? That's called Jewhooing, right? I alerted you to the fact that Robert Shelton was Jewish, right? Robert Shelton wrote a review of a new up-and-coming performer that he discovered in Greenwich Village in one of the coffee houses that were very popular during that era of the folk revival. And it was a new young talent, who just got into town a year earlier. He was from somewhere out in the Midwest. No one quite knew where he was from. But in that first year, he already was establishing a name, making a name for himself, establishing a reputation. And Shelton wrote the first review of him in the New York Times and announced to the world the arrival of the young Bob Dylan. The very same day that Lenny Bruce was arrested. They're all appearing, bursting on the scene right around this moment of reborn Israel pride and Holocaust consciousness and other changes in the social profile of American Jews. This moment, this pregnant moment when so much is going to emerge, these three figures all emerge. A month later, not in September, but later in October, there will be a comedy review off Broadway with the young Dom DeLuise will be one of the actors in it. It will be called Another Evening with Harry Stoons, was the name of this comedy and music review. It played for one night and then closed. It was so terrible. But in that review was a young ingenue named Barbra Streisand. And she will, building on that failure, she will then go up for Broadway roles, and she will, a month later, she will get her first role in a Broadway production. I Can Get It For You Wholesale was the name of the play, and she wins the role of Miss Marmalstein. It will be 2 years later. She was only 19 at the time. She had graduated Erasmus High School in Brooklyn a year early and moved into the city at the age of 18 to pursue an acting career. Her first break comes as Miss Marmalstein. And then it is less than 2 years later that she will be given the starring role in a Broadway musical, which of course catapults her to national fame, and that is Funny Girl. And that's at the age of 21. All of this is before President Kennedy has been killed, because during that year, and I think it was May of 1963, she's already well known enough to be invited to the White House. And the young president says to her, "Oh, my dear, you sing very nicely. How long have you been singing?" I can't do a Kennedy imitation, my apologies. To which she replied, "I've been singing about as long as you've been president," right? With her Brooklyn intonation. It's that same moment that all four of these characters burst on the scene, and now having set the stage by describing these contextual, cultural things that are shifting, that are moving, I then proceed in the rest of the book to go into great depth to describe the rise of their celebrity, but from a Jewish perspective. So I talk at great length about Koufax and the World Series. I talk at great length about Streisand and her nose. I talk at great length about Lenny Bruce and his extraordinary number of comedy routines about Jewishness, about Jewish concerns. He played out those issues on stage through his comedy. It's fascinating. And finally, with Bob Dylan, that chapter was probably the most challenging to write, because Dylan, through much of his career, most of his career, was constantly on the run from being identified as a Jew. He went so far as to convert to, and he did so sincerely for about 3-4 years. He was a born-again evangelical Christian, right? I mean, you can't run far any further away from being Jewish than that. Dylan to this day is enigmatic when it comes to Jewishness. And yet, and here's what the book ultimately is about, and yet the amount of Jewhooing that we do directed at Bob Dylan, the number of comic books and songs and jokes and pieces of art and articles and criticism and other commentary about the Jewishness of Bob Dylan is extraordinary. I easily could have written an entire book about it. It's just the subject of one chapter. And with that, why don't we open it up to questions? I'm more than happy to talk at further length about anything I've talked about up until now, or more than happy to talk about any of these four figures. Again, they are Sandy Koufax, Lenny Bruce, Bob Dylan, and Barbra Streisand. All four very different Jewishly, very different figures in many respects, but in some, they play a major role in creating the Jewish world that we've all been born into and have grown into over the last 50, 60 years. All right, thank you. That was the intro.
Thank you.
Love to take questions.
Okay, we have one hand up. We'll get in a second. I have some questions I want to get to that were in the chat. Chat is now open. Someone had asked, can I close the chat off for a particular person? The answer is no. It's either on for everyone or off for everyone. Sometimes I put it on a little bit, turn it off if I think there's too much chatting going on. So now it's open for everyone. First of all, people are throwing out different names like Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner. Then, and you can't get to everybody. So one of the questions, I guess,
I'm more than happy to talk about others, especially if they fit the bill, right? So very often someone will throw something at me, like Woody Allen, for example, and I'll point out that Woody Allen doesn't reach the height of his fame until the 70s. He's a comedian already in the 60s. He's in the writer's room for Sid Caesar. He's in Greenwich Village nightclubs in the early 60s, but he doesn't make it big until he starts making movies, which starts in 1969 and through the 70s. So he's a little bit later. Mel Brooks, on the other hand, is a very important figure in this regard because his routine with Carl Reiner, the 2,000-year-old man, comes out in 1961. It's that same moment when Jewishness suddenly is on the agenda. Mel Brooks will often say that he was basically playing one of his uncles. He plays an Alta Kaker, right? The joke is that he's 2,000-year-old man. He's 2,000 years old, but the persona, the character he plays is an old Jewish man. Right. So it's there. And Carl Reiner, interestingly enough, plays the very assimilated, Americanized interviewer. So they play off each other. In a way, it's kind of one Jewish generation opposed to the other. And if you know the 2,000-year-old man routines, it has fascinating material for our purpose. And in that regard, one other figure that also hits big right around 61, 62, also putting out comedy record albums. And, comedy record albums in those days was big stuff, right? You went directly from that to the Steve Allen Show and to the Tonight Show. So the other contemporary of theirs was a guy named Alan Sherman. And Alan Sherman, again, most of you, or many of you will be nodding your head, puts out his records, and he becomes an overnight celebrity with palpably Jewish material. Every other song on his records is about his Jewish family, or a Jewish night, or she left me just before Tisha B'Av, with Jewish language, Jewish references. So it's Alan Sherman is also extremely important. And one of the things I love about Alan Sherman is that Cary Grant apparently was a very, very big fan of Alan Sherman, and he was about to go meet had an audience with the Queen in England, and before he went, he brought with him a bunch of those records of the 2,000-year-old man and Alan Sherman, and he shared them. He gave them as a gift to the Queen. So the Queen of England, the greatest Gentile in the world, as they joked, became a fan of this patently Jewish material right around the early 60s. Question. What about Paul Newman? It peaks right at that time. Great. Paul Newman is a really also a fascinating celebrity figure. So you're all kind of I'm gratified that you're getting it, in that Paul Newman is someone who actually becomes a well-known movie star in the late 40s, early 50s. He's been on the scene throughout the 50s, but it's only when he plays the role of Ari Ben Canaan in 1960s The Exodus that he becomes, it's not only at that moment that in interviews he will begin to acknowledge his Jewish father and his own Jewish identity. It's more importantly that this major Hollywood movie star, this hunk of a handsome Hollywood star, it plays an Israeli Sabra heroic figure, and thereby provides a very different image of the Jew for all Americans. It's understandable why we Jews would resonate to it, precisely because it's popular culture. Paul Newman is a major Hollywood star, and it's in that moment in 1960 when Paul Newman, as Ari Ben Canaan, establishes a new touchstone for Jewishness, for public Jewishness. There's a wonderful scene in the film, I'm fairly sure it's not in the novel by Leon Uris, where he's traveling with his American Gentile girlfriend, played by Eva Marie Saint, named Kitty, right, in the film. He's taking her to meet his parents on the kibbutz in the Galil, and he pulls over to the side of the road on the way and takes her on a little hike to see the valley, the Yezreel Valley with Mount Gilboa. And he says, I wanted you to see this. I wanted you to see that this is my land. I'm a Jew, he says to her, right? And I just want you to understand that we Jews, this is our home, and we Jews are different. We like being different. We like having our own singularity and distinctiveness. And she says to him, oh, Ari, she says, she's typically American. She says, all these differences between people are made up. You're just the same as I am. We're all alike. And he says, don't you ever believe it. People are different. It's a fascinating moment of ethnic assertion, of ethnic dividing lines and distinctiveness. I mean, everyone is equal. Everyone has equal rights and equal humanity, but there are cultural and historical differences that need to be preserved at the same time. And to my mind, it's the key moment in that film. And the reason I write about that moment, and the reason I'm sharing it with all of you, is that I take that as indicative of that turning point of the early 60s, when Jewish particularism, when Jewish distinctiveness becomes okay. It no longer is being quashed by, don't be too Jewish. It's that moment that Jewish pridefulness and identification become acceptable. Now, one could argue that we've gone too far, that we've become too prideful and separate and so forth. That's an interesting conversation to have. But historically speaking, there is a moment when that switch is flipped and celebrity plays a major role in that.
So a few quick things that people have been commenting on. There's been a whole debate going on.
I go on too long. I apologize.
No, it's okay. Yeah. There's a whole debate going on whether or not Barbra Streisand had a nose job, just so you know. And people say yes, people say no. So I don't know what the answer is, but some people said eventually she did. Some people say she did something else. So I just bring it up.
With all due respect, the debate is not whether she had the nose job or that. The debate, there is some vagueness about how the decision was made. One story has it that she was backstage at I Can Get It For You Wholesale, and one of the backers of the play, she was chatting with this producer, and she said to him, do you think I should fix my nose? And he said, oh, darling, if you do that, you'll no longer be Barbra Streisand. So she got advice from someone. That's one. Another telling of it is that it was her, she came to it on her own. She realized that if she would no longer be her authentic self, and she was going to have it her way and be gorgeous no matter what she looked like. And in the end, that plays a major, she is an extraordinary voice, and she is a brilliant actress and a brilliant comedian. She is an incredibly talented person. And yet I want to point out that her construction of her own image and her own persona was ingenious in itself, and ought to be, she deserves the credit for having understood not to change her name. She changes Barbara from 3 A's from 3 A's to 2 A's. Right? She changes the spelling of her first name, like just a minor little change, just to indicate that there was something different between Erasmus High in Brooklyn and Greenwich Village in New York. She had undergone a transformation to a degree, but she held on to her Brooklyn Jewish roots and the persona in the crafting of her fame. It became a major element of who Barbra Streisand was. And in case you can't tell, I've never been a big Barbra Streisand has two major fan bases: Jewish women of a certain age and gay men. Now I'm in neither of those categories. I didn't come to Barbra Streisand naturally. And yet through my research and writing about her, I developed tremendous admiration for what a rebel, what a revolutionary she was. Her image has changed over the course of time, not always for the better, but in that early period, she was a pistol. She was just an incredible person.
Before we get to the hands that are raised, just two more questions that I've noticed in the chat from a while ago. Number one is Howard Dragutsky, one of our longtime CSP supporters who grew up in Brooklyn, always likes to remind me about Erasmus High School and the schools where he grew up, and all the famous people like in American history that have come out, maybe that particular that period of history, from that little part of Brooklyn. So is there something magical that's going on in that? I mean, Paul
Ari,
Simon and Garfunkel and everybody, right? They come from that part of New York.
Right. Well, as you know, I have another series of lectures on exactly that subject, right? What is it about the New York Jewish experience that created not only so many well-known figures, but created such a burst of cultural energy and productivity? I mean, it really is mind-boggling. One has to temper that a bit by remembering that we here in New York had the numbers, right? In other words, if most Jews are here, then most famous Jews are going to come from here. To some degree, that does explain it. But nevertheless, I agree with Howard that there is something in the water, or as we say in New York, in the water, that has shaped a certain personality, a certain sense of humor, a certain culture that is New York Jewish culture, which underlies much of that. Yes, I fully agree, and especially given the fact that my father was a graduate of Erasmus High School as well. So have to give it up for Erasmus.
Right. Another question that people brought up is a contemporary, which is we do Jewhoo now, but it's usually for the negative. In other words, when we see something in the news, we're like, we hope that person's not Jewish, or when they're Jewish, it's a shanda, it's a embarrassment for us. And that seems to be more of what we do now than what they did in the 60s. So Bernie Madoff and Stephen Miller, and I probably could go on, of people that have been in the news and are identified as Jews to our chagrin. Is there a radical change in what's going on?
It's a great observation, and it's a really good question. I chose not to write about what might be called negative Jewhooing, right, in the book. I mean, certainly we are aware of the bad Jews. You and I already had a conversation about Jewish gangsters and criminals around this, remember? And I understand that people are fascinated and intrigued by it, but my inclination was, no, those are bad Jews. I don't want to celebrate bad Jews. I think what often occurs here is that the positive Jewhooing is often, and one of the motives is a response to the embarrassment or the shame that we might feel about the bad actors. And certainly in recent years, there have been too many, there's no question, but we still have plenty of heroes and positive figures to point to. And I would argue that it hasn't been, the negative hasn't taken the place of, it might have risen a bit in recent years simply because unfortunately there have been any number of Jewish bad boys, they're mostly men. But the positive goes on, and let me, in that regard, let me add something that I left out earlier, that part of this impulse, part of the habit of Jewhooing is not only a function of the American Jewish experience, it's largely that, but it also comes out of traditional Jewish culture. There is in Yiddish culture, Ashkenazic Yiddish speaking culture, there are two terms, both of which represent a value. One of them is nachas, right? Everyone knows you shep nachas, you derive pleasure from the achievement, usually of your children or someone else close to you, right? You get nachas from their accomplishment, from their success. So there already is in Jewish culture this ingrained habit to project onto someone else or to derive from someone else pleasure. Someone else is famous, that gives me a little bit of pride and status. And similar to that is another Yiddish term, yichus. This one is less well known than nachas, but yichus comes from the Hebrew word yachasim, which simply means connection. Yichus is the status you have by virtue of being connected to someone big. If your brother-in-law's uncle's neighbor's friend is a big judge, is a federal court judge, you have yichus because you're connected to that big shot, to that macher, right? So between yichus and nachas, we, at least in Ashkenazic Jewish culture, we're already kind of inclined to draft off of the success of others. Why? Because we're all connected. We're all family, right? That goes back to the ethnic tie and commonality between Jews. So Barbra Streisand from Brooklyn, from Erasmus High School, is connected to me because I'm a Jew from Brooklyn. My father went to Erasmus. We're New York Jews like her. Her success at some level is my success. There's something very Jewish about that.
Thank you. Cliff Cornell or Sarah, did you have a question? I'm going to unmute you right now.
Yes. You kind of barely touched on it, but a lot of the people who came in the 60s owe their opening in television to a nice Jewish boy named Isaac Sidney Caesar, who had the biggest show in the 50s called Your Show of Shows.
Sure.
His writer's room gave the opening to most of the people you just talked about: Mel Brooks, Neil Simon, Larry Gelbart, Carl Reiner, and Woody Allen. So I think the fact that you kind of basically skipped over him, they would not have come together and done the things and gotten their opening into television and into show business if they hadn't been in that writer's room.
Right. Well, so thank you for the comment. I'm a big admirer of Sid Caesar and the Show of Shows, and also as a historian of comedy and Jewish role in comedy, I'm well aware of its importance. The distinction I would draw is that Sid Caesar's writers and the sketches would often throw in a Yiddish term, or even many Yiddish terms. It was kind of an inside joke. And maybe if you're sitting watching Sid Caesar as a Jewish person, you would hear the Yiddish, and so you got that inside joke, but it remains inside. And that and you can follow that thread with Mel Brooks, for example, who in Get Smart, for example, written by Mel Brooks, very similar to Your Show of Shows, also using Yiddish as something that people are not understanding, but we, the writers, it's entertaining us. And our fellow Jews may pick it up as well. This actually has a long tradition in Jewish show business. The Marx Brothers and others of that era would throw a Yiddish term in. Groucho Marx famously said, "Don't call me Schnorrer," in Animal Crackers, right? So there is a kind of a long-standing trend, and I'm distinguishing between the importance of Sid Caesar and the Jewishness of Sid Caesar, right? What happens after Sid Caesar is an explicit grappling with, confronting of Jewishness. So Lenny Bruce on stage, granted it's not a primetime television show, which is a different level of popular culture, but nevertheless, in the late 50s and early 60s, Lenny Bruce on stage begins not only to throw out Yiddish terms, which is that earlier tradition, but he then begins to talk about it. He says, that word I just said, that's Yiddish. You in the audience who are not Jews, you might not know what that means. I'm going to explain it to you because I'm a Jew. And I'm going to now explain to you the difference between things that are Jewish and things that are Goyish, right? That was one of his most famous routines, Jewish and Goyish. That's a step beyond what Sid Caesar was doing. Again, taking nothing away from Sid Caesar and that amazing writer's room, legendary for good reason. The Jewish element is what I'm tracking, and that does change. And then the last thing I'll say there is tell Mel Brooks in 2,000-Year-Old Man, in Get Smart, it's subtext. It's hidden. You have to search it out. A decade later, Mel Brooks gets on board with this new trend, and look at what he does in 1968's Blazing Saddles. He has the Indian chief speaking Yiddish in a way that you can't miss, the Jewishness of his new humor. So it's a matter of how explicit, how self-conscious and self-referential is the Jewish content. And again, we could talk at much greater length about that, but I hope I addressed the question. But thank you. Sid Caesar is, obviously all-time great.
Bimya, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering when you spoke to the conditions that created the ability for this sort of this firestorm of Jewishness. When looking at things today, when you spoke about ethnic Jews, like do you see, or Jews of color, do you see conditions that are causing that to happen where people are more open to being openly Jewish and a Jew of color?
So thank you. I'm going to take that opportunity to talk about anti-Semitism, if you don't mind. I think that's one answer to your question. Another element, another factor in the early 60s that I didn't mention was that anti-Semitism was at a low ebb. In the decades following the Holocaust, public, explicit anti-Semitism was completely discredited in American culture. Certainly, there were no anti-Semitic barriers, forms of discrimination, preventing Jews from moving headlong into American society. But also anti-Semitic attitudes were also tamped down. And as we're all aware, they have come back in the recent decades. The 21st century, sad to say, has been a period of renewed, resuscitated anti-Semitism. And the reason I'm making this point is that where it certainly has an effect on our physical well-being, and that understandably is our first concern, to protect our physical selves. It also has an emotional, psychological impact as well. The degree to which anti-Semitism is valent in society has an effect on how we behave as Jews. A simple example would be the wearing of a kippah, right? I mean, until fairly recently, a Jew wearing a kippah on a college campus or in any one of our cities felt free to do so. Many Orthodox and other men who wear kippot and women who wear kippot are now thinking twice about such public Jewish identification. Wearing a chai around your neck, I mean, that sort of thing is suddenly problematic in a way it wasn't for most of the period I've been talking about. So things have changed, not for the better, and hopefully we'll get back on track, and history will prove to be cyclical in this regard. But I think at the moment we're experiencing a period when Jewishness is fraught. And it does, and I will say that it does seem to be somewhat cyclical. I mean, one of the things that I write about in the book is the odd coincidence that seemed to me between that period of the 60s, when suddenly you had Kennedy and then Johnson were appointing Jewish Supreme Court justices, and then you have in the 90s under President Clinton, you kind of have a renewal of that kind of assertion of public Jewishness. So I do think that we're just in a downward turn at the moment, and for all of the challenges we face in this regard, things will get better. It's kind of like the stock market, it's down now, but it will come back eventually.
One note I saw earlier was just I assume it's from a Canadian who took who took note that you've only referenced, when you talk about stars in America, you only refer to the, North America, when you don't reference the Canadians, but she said that there are many funny Jewish comedians who come out of Canada and important people from Canada. So I just want to bring that up,
thank you for repeating that. It's an occupational hazard. I'm an American Jewish historian, and by America, that references the United States, and Canada is always excluded in one way or another. It's always given short shrift, as are other countries around the world. There are other Jewish communities that are worthy of attention. We American Jews tend to be somewhat ethnocentric, I guess, and certainly is the case with me. So I apologize on one hand. However, having said that, I would make a case for the uniqueness of this phenomenon in America per se. The Jewish comedians coming from Canada are great comedians. Gilda Radner, Dan Levy, all sorts of people coming from that direction. But the nature of Jewishness is different in Canada, right? What I was talking about earlier with the ethnic and the religious, the ballad for Americans, that doesn't necessarily apply in the same way to the Canadian Jewish world. Canadian Jews have a different experience. Canadian Jewish identity has, certainly some commonality, but also distinctiveness. So I would still resist lumping it all together. And in the same way that I still want to give props to Sid Caesar, I'll give props to Gilda Radner, et cetera, as well. A lot of talented people from Canada, no question.
Okay, last few questions. We are about 4 minutes left. So Stan Heimowitz, did you have a question you wanted to ask? You have to unmute if you'd like to ask. Are you still there, Stan?
Could you explain what for people today are good Jews? I mean, you mentioned, I grew up in the 60s. Who would you mention today as people who are good influencers?
There are a ton of them, but Stan, let me turn it back to you, and I want to use you as a proof text. The very fact that you would question being a good Jew as it's reflected by people in the public eye is proof of my my thesis here, right? We care about how they comport themselves because we care about how Jews are seen. We believe that there is something as being a good Jew. We have certain values that conform to good Jewishness, right? Different Jews will have different values, perhaps, but I think most of us have some sense that being Jewish is a good thing. Our reputation isn't always that great. There's this thing called anti-Semitism, which calls Jewishness into question. And it's therefore it's our business. We make it our business to want to constantly have the Jewish image be accurate and ultimately, we hope, positive. So I'm completely with you. I think there are a tremendous amount of people in the public eye who would fit that bill.
How about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, maybe?
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. I'm the book I'm writing now is I'm writing a biography of a Jewish woman I see as a hero, as someone who is just absolutely exemplary, and her name is Ruth Messenger.
Okay.
So she's kind of that's a hero of mine that I would say. But in Hollywood as well, there are a lot of good eggs. I mentioned Adam Sandler before. He's a very good Jewish role model. If you've heard him talk about it, and actually I think this is one area that I think things have gotten a little bit better. Hollywood, it used to be that until fairly recently, explicit Jewishness, being too Jewish, was still operative in Hollywood. In other words, there was still a kind of a suppression of this. That's changed. People like Judd Apatow and Sandler and various executives in Hollywood, and Gal Gadot, the Wonder Woman, and any number of figures have begun to change that. Mayim Bialik and the aforementioned Natalie Portman. Tremendous. I was when I lived in LA, I used to go to a synagogue called Ikar, and the last time I was there was for the high holidays several years ago, and standing right behind me was Natalie Portman, right? And sitting in the front row was the mayor of LA. So public Jewishness is I think is actually gotten better. in certain respects, despite what I was saying earlier about anti-Semitism. But I would, as a historian, I do still like to point to that 60s moment when it all began to come into focus. So I hope I addressed your question.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Last two questions. Sandy Polishuk, do you have a question? Again, we have very limited time, so please limit to a question. Go ahead, unmute. Sandy, if you're there. Otherwise, I have to keep moving. Shoshana, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, but I would go with Schlachter. Do you have a question you wanted to ask? I'm asking you to unmute if you wanted to unmute.
Yeah, perfect. You pronounced it perfectly. My comment basically is I'm Canadian living in Canada. Both my daughters are millenniums, and they absolutely hate when I say something so is Jewish. I can't even do it anymore. So is it that the millenniums don't want to pick up on that and want to be sort of part of the general culture, where we kind of like the differentiation and, as you say, the yichus we all got from somebody Jewish, but my daughters, absolutely not.
Yeah,
It's a good question.
Thank you, Shoshana. Right? Thank you. Yes, no, absolutely. I said earlier that much of this ethnic interest is declining, is becoming less fashionable, and certainly it's a generational issue. One of the figures I write about is a cousin of Sandy Koufax named Deborah Cass. Has anyone seen there's this wonderful public sculpture now in New York? It's the letters O-Y from one direction, and then you go around to the other side and it spells yo, right? So that's done by the artist Deborah Cass. She also did a series of portraits of Barbra Streisand and of her cousin Sandy Koufax. I interviewed her. She happens to be a gay woman. She told me that in her family, her mother, she said this to her, she had a conversation with her mother once, that she said, "Mom, the way you notice Jews in Hollywood is the way I notice gays in Hollywood." Right? Which is to say that it does change from generation to generation, but still these kinds of habits die hard. So your millennial kids may not be as Jewish interested and focused, but celebrity and the Jewhooing in its essence are still there. And one of the beautiful things about studying Jewish history, taking the long view, is you look at your kids and you go, oi. I look at history and I see what happens with their kids and what happens with their kids. And the beauty of the Jewish experience is that it really has been cyclical, is that for all of the moving away, there is an equal amount of return and revival. And I would just offer my own positive take to you, and I hope that helps.
Right.
I'm sure your kids are great kids.
What you're telling Shoshana is if she has grandchildren, hang out with them.
Exactly.
Sandy,
you know why grandparents and grandchildren are always so close, right? Because they have a common enemy. Right. Okay.
Okay. We're gonna try. Sandy, go ahead. Quick question.
Yeah, David, I put something in the chat, but I'm really curious. When I was a teenager, I saw an article in Look or Life magazine that, they had that big format, photo format. And that was my first experience of Barbra Streisand. And it was an article about her as someone singing in the Village, I think. And what I remembered was that the big thing they said about her was not her nose, but what she wore, that she dressed in vintage clothing that she got in used shops, and how unusual that was for a performer. So have you seen that article, and where was it and when?
In my research, I probably came across it. I don't know it offhand, but certainly she was popping up in that kind of literature quite a bit. What you're describing is her eccentric kook persona that she created. So on the one hand, the word kook is going to be applied to her over and over again. It kind of comes out of it sort of was a word in the beatnik period. It's pre-hippie, it's pre-60s counterculture, right? Yeah. So her wearing vintage clothing and playing the role of the kook got her a lot of attention. She not only was appearing as a singer in downtown clubs, she was appearing on TV chat shows, because they kept inviting her back because they never knew what she'd say next. She was so outrageous, right? The interesting part to that is the timing, right? 5 years later, everybody would be outrageous. Abby Hoffman and right, the hippies. She was one of the progenitors of that, just as was Lenny Bruce, just as was Bob Dylan, right? It's the 60s before it became the 60s. Barbra Streisand was very much a part of that. And again, this is largely forgotten because she becomes so big and so, so successful that we tend to see her as this, this Malibu person. And of course, Barbra Streisand, because she's a woman, because she's Jewish, and because she's so highly talented and successful, will have a tremendous amount of hatred directed at her. I call it anti-Streisandism, right? So that's also affected her image, and it's one of the goals of my book to restore a little bit of our awareness of that early period of hers. She was really, quite something.
Last question. When you were writing the book, you chose the four figures: Sandy Koufax, Lenny Bruce, Bob Dylan, and Barbra Streisand. Was anybody on the cutting room floor? You chose those four. Was there one or two people that you just didn't make it into that book, or was this just the four of these were easy? Like,
I mentioned Alan Sherman earlier. It was Alan Sherman. What led me to this subject in the first place was I found Alan Sherman's memoir in a used bookstore. He wrote it in 1965. In other words, he was very, very, very famous, 62, 63, 64. He writes his memoir in 65. And it alerted me to the fact, and I knew Alan Sherman, I didn't realize it was the early 60s. So that alerted me to the fact that something's going on in that period, in those years. So Alan Sherman might have been a part of it. Mel Brooks might have been part of it. There's a long, Theodore Bickel might have been, Shlomo Karbach might have been. No, there's at some point in the book, I list a whole bunch of early 60s Jewish figures who also are representing Jewishness in a new way. However, none of them have quite the same level of fame as my four. What unifies the four I chose was just an extraordinary height of celebrity, fame and fortune and public image. It's an interesting question. Who are the most famous Jews in American life? I determined, it's partly subjective, but I would stand by it, that my four were the most famous, at least in the 1960s and perhaps overall. Possible exception of Lenny Bruce.
60s were not really my period. I don't know how old you are, David. I'm going to assume maybe not yours either, but for many people I see.
How's that?
Yes, I was born in 1967, everybody. So I know these people. I watched Mrs. Maisel, so I knew about Lenny Bruce. Now I would say Lenny Bruce has made a big comeback because of Mrs. Maisel, right?
So I've yet to publish anything on that. I'm watching Mrs. Maisel with great interest. It's not Lenny Bruce, it's a character by that name and based on it, but you lose the historical veracity, unfortunately. I figured out at some point watching Mrs. Maisel that it's not meant to be historical. It's not meant to be a period piece. It's a fable. It's like a Broadway musical. So they can take those kinds of liberties, and it hasn't bothered me quite as much. But if it does bring attention back to Lenny Bruce, I think that will certainly be a good thing.
I think that is the case, and people are researching it. But for now, everybody went over because the subject was so interesting. Thank you all for your questions, your comments. And, again, Canada, this was not meant to exclude you, but thank you for sharing your Canadian heroes with us in the chat. David, thank you for another great program about American history and some people that we all know now maybe know a little better about, and particularly understand the 60s, what was going on. For those of you who this was your heyday, I don't know whether what David explained to you now resonates in a different way, or you knew it already. I don't know. But I know in either way, I've learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot today. I'm going to go back and spend some quality time with my kids on Father's Day. David, any closing statement you want to share with us?
Happy Juneteenth. I hope everyone who's had COVID is making a full recovery. Refuah shlema to you, Ari, and your family, and hope to see you all again sometime soon.
Okay, everybody. Go take a break. Lots to celebrate today. If you're on the program, you're alive. That's a good thing. It's a nice day out there. Keep safe. Ingrid Rothman, I see your smiling face. Laney as well. Rubens. Yes, I will have dinner with you, Rubens. We will do it. We'll make it happen this summer. Okay. I want to spend time with you guys. Okay, everybody. Susan Glass, nice to see you. I'm going to get a drink of water. Enjoy the rest of my day. Ed Medros from New England. Always a pleasure to have you with us in the room. Take care. Bye, Faith. Bye, everybody. Be safe. Bye, Ida. Okay, bye. Bye, Deborah Heyman.